Good afternoon. I somehow volunteered for the first session after lunch. So I'm supposed to keep you all awake. So towards that aim to inform, edify, and keep you awake, we're going to do a first ever function here for History Camp. History Camp being known for its innovations. The title of my talk refers to a book in progress, Ill-Fated Frontier, that's due to be published and available in bookstores in the year 2020. Since I am still writing it, and the publisher is very interested that I deliver it on time, there are some aspects to how I present this non-fiction story that I'm making some choices about. So rather than do that arbitrarily in a back room over a typewriter or PC equivalent of it, I'm going to pass out to you some ballots in the form of a survey where I'm going to solicit your advice on some key aspects of presenting a nonfiction story in book form. So towards that end, my sister, Elizabeth Forman, who is till recently a teacher at Boston Latin School, has agreed to assist me. So we're going to pass out these survey forms. And I want you to just have them handy because the cast of characters is large. That's one of my challenges, too large. So you could use this as a dance card to follow some of the things that I'll be talking about. And then we'll ask you to answer the questions towards the end of the presentation and collect them. And if there's any time left over, we will let there be light. Yes, and there was light. We'll have a question and answer. So I usually like to go interactive with question and answers during my talks, but for this one, we have such a amount of territory to cover. Quite literally, you'll see. Let's keep question and answers for the end, and if we're short from time, I'll stay over. Now, some of you know of me. I'm an author and historian. I'm a physician, very interested in the American Revolutionary era and the early Republic, probably best known as a biographer of the Revolutionary War hero, Dr. Joseph Warren. And for any of those who have a burning desire to have your own copy autographed, you can tackle me afterwards, and I brought a few copies. My biography of Warren is not to be confused with a more recent one, which has some issues about scholarship that leave people who are serious about history to continue to look at my history. I also wrote a young adult fiction, a Revolutionary War era, and I think from that I decided that my biggest audience is nonfiction, rigorous nonfiction. You can follow me on Twitter, Dr. Sam Forman, where I tweet on American Revolution type issues and also public commemorations in the region that have something to do with that. I also am the host of drjosephwarren.com, which has hundreds of full-text transcriptions.
Does anyone need a pencil? Sorry. No? Everybody's good? Okay.
Okay. So if later on when you're actually filling out this form you decide you need a pencil or something like that, the other Dr. Forman will help you out. So at any rate, here's the aims for today. So Ill-Fated Frontier is actually the recovery of a history of the Western frontier in the Revolutionary era, late Revolutionary era, that has been published before. And I'll tell you a little bit about it and while I would want to retell this story. So I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about, as an author, some aspects of writing a nonfiction history aimed not at an academic audience, but for a general audience. What are some of those considerations? We distributed the survey form, and then I'm going to run through the story, at least in outline. And that's where the geography comes. We're going to go over the personalities and the main events, and then I'm going to solicit your opinions. The form of the survey looks like a test, but it's not a test. This is history camp. It can't be a test. But it is a survey form, or like a focus group, where you're advising on how this story should be related in book form. So let me tell you how I got interested in this. I ran into a very enthusiastic reader of my Warren biography who had very nice things to say. And she said, I see you were born and raised in Philadelphia. You must be related to the Revolutionary era Formans of Philadelphia and New Jersey. I said, no, I never heard of anybody like that. He said, you must be. So it went back and forth, and it got kind of amusing. You know, how could you be so sure that you have nothing to do with these people? I said, you know, you're talking about people who were in the Revolutionary War, and you know, if I could qualify as the Jewish, you know, sons of Ellis Island or something like that, but I don't have anything to do with the Revolutionary War. But nevertheless, she gave me a copy of a published version of this diary of a group that went down the Ohio and Mississippi River in 1789, 1790. And I read it, and I was spellbound by it. It's about 60 pages long. It's not terribly long, but it's very dense. It's a first-hand narrative of a pioneer journey of this time frame and of this sort. And as such, it's very rare. There's only about 2 or 3 known. I mean, there's plenty been written about the West, even in this very early period of the West. But the idea of a first-hand account of it is extremely unusual. And it was written by Samuel S. Forman, and I'm Samuel A. Forman, so there's going to be a lot of confusion there. And it really got my attention. I'm going to tell you the story, and maybe I'm the only one who was fascinated by this, but I was taken aback, like, did this really happen? And I just couldn't believe what I was reading. So why? Now, the reason why it was published before was antiquarians, or really disciplined historians of the 19th century, recognized the unique aspect of this travel account. Lyman Draper is the founder of the Wisconsin Historical Society, and he was an inveterate collector of Westernalia. And he encountered this manuscript in the, I think, 1880s, and he immediately recognized it as something important. Now, one of the downsides of it, it was actually written decades after the events that it describes. But it has very specific recollections of people and personalities and incidents and things like that that Samuel S. Forman recalled and was written down 50, 60 years after the fact. So Lyman Draper checked out everything, every name and place and incident that he could possibly verify from independent sources, was able to verify at least 95% of them being correct, which lends credence to the value of the narrative. And again, he made sure it was published, but also to the events it describes where it is the only source. So I determined that I was going to retell this story. And in so doing, putting in its context of more recent scholarship that touches on this era and adds some perspectives that Samuel S. Forman did not share in the 19th century. So, what does it mean to write popular history on a scholarly base? Scholarly base to me means that everything in this story be true, nonfiction, have primary sources to back it up, and to be shown in footnotes and endnotes. But by popular, you want to tell a story that's engaging, that has a balance between amusing and engaging, and the scholarship is there, but it shouldn't get in the way. Like one of the most, I think, important kind of compliments that could be paid to popular nonfiction is that it reads like a novel. And what does that mean exactly? So I was familiar with and actually specifically visited some recent bestsellers of popular nonfiction in recent years, and with an idea to the mechanics, what does that mean? Well, to my reading, and I'm not familiar with anybody who's actually opined on this in a systematic way, so this is all me, right? Is that if you have a story, you focus in on a few prominent individuals who are very engaging, and you treat them as if they're characters. But it's nonfiction, so you can't make up anything. It's all gotta be happening, right? And you wanna pepper it with dialogue and conversations, but this is nonfiction, so that means every conversation has to have been recorded somewhere or been in somebody's diary, right? So they have a character development that they're in the story, but ideally they change in certain ways over time by the experience, and you can empathize with them, whether they're heroes or villains. Visuals are important. Maybe this is a sign of our times, but if you write about somebody and you don't have a picture of them, it's like a real downer. We're a real visual society. People like to have their pictures. So, I mean, you could make, historical reconstructions, but if you have the real thing, real period visuals of these people, it's a huge plus for popular history. If you're dealing with figures who are not well known, if they anchor to people who are well known in certain of the interactions, that gives your readers a certain comfort and maybe even enthusiasm to understand your main characters better. So my read of popular nonfiction is that you want a propulsive main narrative. Someone says, fine, that's like a novel. And for those who are probably mostly history nerds, you want to know, where did that come from? Is that possibly true? Go to the endnotes, go to the footnotes, and I'll show it. But it also has the discipline to me that if there are certain interactions that just beg to be fleshed out, that unless there are primary sources that allow me to do that, I can't do that. So that is a challenge. Okay, so this is the input as an all-time first that I'd mentioned. Let me just give you an orientation to the survey form, so when it's time to dig into it, it won't be mysterious. There are 8 questions. Each question, which ties to some kind of quandary that I've been dealing with, gives you a number of choices. I'm asking you to rank order the choices. Each question, will ask for top 2, 3, 4 of your choices. There are little boxes provided. You write the numbers of your choices in the boxes, and I can be pretty concrete, so I'll give you an example. This is not a question, but this is just how they're structured. What's your favorite colors? I give you some choices, green, red, blue, whichever color is this year's History Camp t-shirt. What color is it? Red? Okay, boy, that's confusing. Okay, or something else, no preference. So that's the way you would fill it out, if those were your preferences. Fill, top preference, number 1, 2, 3, in the box. I only asked for 3. There you go. So I'm gonna ask you to do that towards the end of the lecture. Okay, so let's go on this trip. What is this ill-fated frontier? It's a narrative that follows a group of pioneers from central New Jersey, Monmouth, New Jersey, who depart in November 1789 for Natchez in Spanish West Florida, covering a distance of approximately 2,400 miles over the entire trans-Allegheny frontier. One of the things that first struck me was that the places being talked about, I didn't even much recognize where they were. because there are modern names versus old names. Now, I've already decided to predominantly use modern names, so you have some notion as to where these places were. But there in order are the locations of this pioneer trip. And basically, they are leaving the then current United States. Let me take a little bit more about unfamiliarity of the geography of this. The first thing I did was look at a map. And the territory being covered, this is a cover of a New Yorker magazine from 1976. And it was, I guess, put as a joke at the time. It's like a map of the United States. In the foreground, it has Manhattan. And then looking west, as our pioneers did, there's a Pacific Ocean there somewhere, and there's pretty much nothing in between. It's flyover territory. In 1976, this was a joke. It still is. I think it's one of the most popular New Yorker magazine covers around. They reproduce them. You would buy these things, right? But in light of the 2016 election, you might want to revisit the mindset behind this and maybe take it a little bit more seriously. So at any rate, how about a real map? Map of the United States after the Treaty of Paris, the peace with Great Britain, ending the Revolutionary War. What does the United States look like? This is an official map. This one was published in London, but it was distributed here in the United States, and it shows the United States at that time. Looks very neat. The situation on the ground was less than neat during that time frame. Actually, in the Northwest Territory, the British did not give up all their forts. They said that the restitution of loyalist landholders was incomplete as required by the Treaty of Paris, and they weren't going to vacate the Northwest Territory entirely until it was. So Fort Detroit, Fort Mackinac, and other forts in the Great Lakes continued to be held by the British. Not only that, if you ask the Indians on the ground, the Delaware tribe and the Miami tribe and the Shawnee tribe, whose territory that was, they did not recognize the United States, and they didn't recognize Britain's right to cede their territory to the United States. They were perfectly willing, though, to continue trading with the British for guns and furs and things like that from the British outposts. Now, you go down the Mississippi, you've got the Spanish down here in what they called Spanish West Florida, which Spain had conquered from the British late in the Revolutionary War as allies of the United States, the Battle of Pensacola. And now they laid claim to this area, but the Indians around there may not have agreed either that these borderlands belonged to either the Spanish or the Americans. So that is the reality on the ground in the 1780s. Here's a map that maybe is a little bit more interpretive, but even this is aspirational. It has this Spanish territory as being very neat. The borders of that, in fact, were very indistinct. Here's North Carolina claiming territory all the way to the Mississippi. This is modern Tennessee. Virginia, as a state, still had a territory that we would now call West Virginia, and Kentucky. The main direction of these pioneers are from Monmouth in central New Jersey, across Pennsylvania to Lancaster, to Fort Pitt, where they get rid of their wagon train and get on flatboats, float the entire Ohio River, Fort Wheeling, Marietta, Cincinnati, Louisville, etc., down to the future Memphis, what we would call Vicksburg, and then to Natchez in the Spanish West Florida. Okay, So here's where this mini story starts. It starts with a conversation between General Black David Forman. That's a nickname. He got that nickname as the terror to the New Jersey Loyalists. He's involved in extrajudicial executions of Loyalists. He was George Washington's eyes and ears in the late Revolutionary War guerrilla campaigns of northern New Jersey. He never actually served as a general. He was appointed as a Continental General in 1778, but the Continental Army got reorganized before he ever took command of troops, so he never actually was a general. But he was a legend in his own mind, so he insisted that everybody call him general. His pictures are in the Continental General's uniform, and everybody, in fact, did call him general and thought of him that way. He was a very imposing guy. And there is a picture of him on the right with this sort of raised eyebrows, suspicious of people. Not a warm and fuzzy character, I would say. So he had a proposition. He didn't like the world of New Jersey in the post-revolutionary period. He felt that his achievements in the world were not being properly recognized. And he was a plantation owner in the Monmouth County. And so he called in his young cousin, Samuel S. Forman, who was too young to have participated in the Revolutionary War and looked up to his many relatives who had been veterans of almost any battle that you could imagine. And he would revel in telling their stories, and he kind of deferred to these people who were just a little bit older than he and were Revolutionary War veterans. He was making a mark in some trading as a clerk in a counting house in New York City, had a penchant for business. He went as a business agent, or what they call supercargo, about age 20, on a shipment of grain down to Charleston, South Carolina. So he was known in the family as being kind of a bright young fella, bushy-tailed. So General Forman calls him in and says, I've got a proposition for you. In so many words, I'm paraphrasing. We do have some of the exact conversation, actually. And he said, I have determined to send my older brother Ezekiel down to Spanish West Florida because I have spoken to the Spanish envoy to the United States, who was then resident in New York, and have a couple of 1,000-acre land grant in Natchez, Spanish West Florida, free for the taking. The only requirement is we have to settle there and put it under cultivation. The first year's crops, tobacco, will be guaranteed to be sold in New Orleans into the Spanish international trade for hard money at good prices. So I'm going to send Ezekiel, and I'm going to send my sidekick from the Revolutionary War, Benajah Osman, to go there with my 60 slaves. Not 6, 60. You're going to go there and you're going to settle it, and I'll pay you 100 pounds to do this. Payable when you come back. So Samuel S. Forman was intrigued, and he signed up. So who are these Formans that are no relationship to me? Well, there's General Black David. There's his wife, Anna Marsh, whom he considers crazy for reasons that are unclear, despite the fact that he's having babies with her during this time frame. His favorite is Sarah Forman, the eldest daughter. Very unusual in this time frame. He favors her in everything. I got to think of her as Ivanka or something. She's very beautiful, blonde. And the general favors her in everything. And his future son-in-law, William G. Forman, who now Sarah and William G. are first cousins. And that's one way not to have to change your name when you get married if you marry your first cousin. Ezekiel Forman, he's the older brother. He's going to have the slaves lent to him and actually go on this trip. No image. His wife, Margaret Forman, Benajah Osman is the plantation overseer in Monmouth and former flunky of the general during the war. And amongst these 60 slaves, I know just a couple of their names. This is a challenge. There's Jenny, or Mammy Jenny, is the head enslaved person of General Forman's household. And then there are just two people identified as two disaffected fellows. And they come into the story soon enough. Now, just before they depart, General Forman was very deliberate about this. He was aware that some of his enslaved people had family members on adjoining plantations. So rather than it be a source of irritation during this forced immigration, he went out of his way to sell some of the slaves to neighboring plantation owners in Monmouth, New Jersey, to keep the families together, and buy other ones to keep the family units together. So it's not only 60 slaves, but it's 17 family units who are deliberately being kept together. So they cross Washington's Crossing in retrograde from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. With a few days on the road, they show up in Lancaster. The sheriff of Lancaster, Hubley, stops them. 6 wagons, 90 people, including the slaves, the Forman families, some of their retainers. What business do you have in carrying this human cargo across Pennsylvania when we have passed an anti-slavery, slow emancipation law in 1780? Meanwhile, the ladies of Lancaster, while the papers are being checked, approach the slaves with offers that they work domestic services in households in Lancaster and basically free themselves. These proto-abolitionists, ladies of Lancaster. At a time when abolitionism was not really known to be active, actually to intervene in that time frame, they do in Lancaster, and you'll have to read the book to find out who all they were and how this ended up. Apparently, Mammy Jenny, I will say, denounced the plot and gave the owners, the Benajah Osman, intervened and defused the situation. So they continue across Pennsylvania, manhandle these wagons across the old Forbes Road, and they run out of provisions in the mountains. So they have some frontier-type adventures, which I won't go into because I want to cover the whole story. So they, short of Fort Pitt, these two disaffected fellows get together with a frontier sheriff and arm the slaves. Armed insurrection. And there's a showdown with the overseers, Benajah Osman. And you'll have to read the book as to how that turns out. But as you can infer, they didn't successfully rebel. It took 3 weeks to get to across Pennsylvania. Once they get to Fort Pitt, and they're traveling in the wintertime deliberately in order to catch the rising of the Ohio River, which is the way that you would go down the Ohio River. So they stay in Fort Pitt. The town there, all of a population of about 300. They get rid of their wagons. They sell most of their horses, and they build boats. Or they have boats built using some of their own labor to float the Ohio. Floating the Ohio is an iffy proposition because the Northwest Indian Federation dominated the Northwest Territory. Within yards of the sparse American forts, the soldiers themselves were getting scalped and murdered, much less settlers and squatters. Going down the river was running the gauntlet because you would have to tie up your boats on a moonless night along the shore. You got trees right up to the shore. You're very vulnerable, and that's when the Indians were feared to attack the people just going down the Ohio River, who were not actually settling, but just going down the river. They were really open season. But that's not the only thing, the river itself. So the first day out, so they don't have like river boatmen. They're like winging it, which was pretty much the way people were doing it in 1789 to control these boats. They had two boats. One was a flat boat, which is like a big cigar box. You know, if you ever saw a cigar box, it was 15 feet wide and 60 feet long. And then they also had a keel boat, like in this picture, which is a boat with a keel, which could go down as far as New Orleans and then get poled all the way back to Pittsburgh if you had some muscle power. So in the first night out, they tie up, and they're really scared that the Indians are going to come out of nowhere when they're tied up. And the boat itself, which maybe wasn't all that well made, got caught in its mooring, and the gunwale got ripped off. This is at night, pitch black, no lanterns because they're afraid the Indians are going to see them. One of the slave boys goes overboard, or so they think. And in that time, probably seconds, I think Samuel S. Forman, who is enabling the slave enterprise, shows his chops. Does he jump in the water and save the boy and possibly drown himself? There are no lights. Does he have the lights come on and invite the Indians? The enslaved boy's family is there, wailing, being shushed so they don't attract the Indians. Have to read the book to find out what happens. Samuel S. Forman gets in the spotlight on that one. So they visit the Americans at Marietta, Ohio, which is one of the early fortified places. They run into a Massachusetts guy, Winthrop Sargent, who simultaneously is a primary member of the Ohio Company. He sold more shares in the Ohio Company, land speculators, than anybody else. But he's also a surveyor for the government, taking the Indian lands. This is the one thing the Indians hate more than anything else, and lining them up, chopping them up into saleable lots. He's one of them. He's there. He's a dour person. He's a Harvard graduate. He has some very wonderful view of what the West as an experience could do for humankind. But the actual people, the settlers he runs into, he's very condescending towards, and they're dirty, and he sounds like somebody from Harvard Yard, basically, some bad type stereotype of that. And he has extensive writings. Maybe he had a little bit of a smile because his wife was pregnant, was about to give birth. So they go on down the river. The Confederacy has the upper hand. One of the preferred tactics of the Indians during that time, this is further down the river from Marietta, a little bit further than Cincinnati, was to take a Caucasian person and set them up on the shore to yell and scream in distress. The Indians are going to kill me, things like that. And lure the boats off the river to come and tie up to save the person. But in fact, the person was allied with the Indians and would attack the boats. And it sounds pretty melodramatic, but actually happened quite a bit. One of them was a red-headed teenager who was Chief Little Turtle's son-in-law. He had been taken captive in an Indian raid in Kentucky in the early 1780s, and he went into the Indian culture, as they say, even married into it. So when settlers would see this red-headed Caucasian, yelling plaintively for help, they would be tempted to come, and then the Shawnee tribe would do their thing. Now, when you would be attacked by Indians, you never know how it would turn out. You could be slaughtered on the spot in the most outrageous way, butchered. You could be taken hostage. You could be adopted into the tribe, and you never know which one it would be. Oh, that's a pretty intimidating thought. So they get down to Louisville, which then was called Falls of the Ohio. The pioneer group splits up. The main group, including the enslaved, go downriver. And Samuel S. Forman sets us shop for a couple of months in Louisville, and he has kind of comedy of manners, if you will. I mean, it's not deliberately comedy, although he did have a sense of humor in dealing with the locals at this sort of proto-southern town. Population about 200 at the time. But they're having balls and parties and riots and stuff like that. And he has his pet bear, and he's trading to get as much tobacco as he possibly can get, and furs for later trading downriver. He meets General James Wilkinson. Now, of course, it's a serious buck. When I have a picture of him, I won't say sleaze. But I would say that this guy, I'd never heard of him before this, but this guy was Secretary of War for a while after this time frame. But he was a prominent personality in Kentucky and on the frontier. He was on the active payroll of the Spanish. At the same time, he was the Secretary of War. Gee, I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip ahead. So he meets some interesting personalities, right? You go downriver, they come into the friendly Indians. They have culture clashes with them. Meet the Spanish. Spanish, very urbane. There's not a lot of them, but they're very sophisticated. And they welcome the Forman pioneers in 1790. Manuel Gueso de Lemos, very educated, fully trilingual, I think, English, Spanish, French, had gone to school in London. He's in charge there. The Spanish Inquisition is not operable in Spanish West Florida deliberately. They very much welcome the Americans. Here's some of the Spanish society that the Americans meet. Galvez was the fellow who actually conquered Spanish West Florida. But the ones most important to the Formans are Gueso and William Dunbar. Not a Spanish name. He's a holdover from the English, who just kind of, goes from one administration to another. Stephen Minor is an ex-Pennsylvanian who has become a Spaniard. So the Afro-Americans, they're laboring hard. They're building the plantations out of nothing. Wilderness Plantation, later Second Creek. As plantations, they're very successful. They're thriving demographically. 60 of them arrived. 5 years later, there's 90 of them. Families intact. The Americans there, a lot of them are dying of febrile diseases, probably malaria, things like that. Samuel Forman has an opportunity to stay. The Spanish want him to stay. They offer him 800 acres. What's that, about a good part of the size of Manhattan? As a plantation, a choice land if he stays and becomes a plantation entrepreneur. He decides, no, it's not for me, he goes back. The Indians are busy with each other down in Mississippi. There's some territorial disputes between the tribes. The Spanish and Americans not directly involved. They decide to play one of their big ball games at one point, which is a predecessor to lacrosse. And they do that in central Mississippi. It degenerates into an actual battle. And at a time when there are maybe only 3,000 Indians in all of the Mississippi Territory, 500 of them get killed by each other in one day. So that kind of spares the Formans in Natchez of issues with the Native Americans. Meanwhile, back in the Northwest Territory, the Indians beat the U.S. Army, the Battle with No Name, also known as St. Clair's Defeat, or the Battle of the Wabash. A lot of issues there involving George Washington, amongst other people. Winthrop Sargent is a key person in that battle, so we know a lot about his role there. Back in Natchez, Ezekiel Forman dies. His wife makes a play to take over the plantations. They're out of U.S. territory. Possession is 9/10. My husband died, they're mine. General David Forman hears about this, hopping mad, which is his usual standpoint anyway. He takes the first opportunity to come down to Natchez, takes his wife, his sister-in-law to court, over the ownership of the plantations. Meanwhile, the Americans get their act together, takes them 3-4 years, and finally defeat the Indians in the Northwest Territory, Battle of the Fallen Timbers. Meanwhile, the Americans are trying to assert sovereignty over the Mississippi Territory, which they get in a treaty in 1795, but the Spanish are not quick to leave. And settlers, like the Forman families, would much rather deal with the Spanish than with the Americans, even though they are Americans. Okay, so General David Forman wins over his sister-in-law, but he's so upset, he has a stroke in Natchez. He's in poor health. He determines to come back to New Jersey to spend his last years. He has quite an adventure trying to get back. It involves privateers. He runs into Lord Dunmore in Bermuda, which would be the worst nightmare for someone who has the reputation of being the terror of the Loyalists. And he dies, and he eventually gets back to New Jersey, but he's pickled in a barrel of rum. Meanwhile, George Washington receives the Indian leaders with honors, including some of the defeated ones in Philadelphia. And there are set-piece meetings with speeches that are very impressive. And George Washington, instead of going into some possible genocidal kind of rage against the Indians, which some people were advocating at the time, instead treats them as sovereign nations and listens to them with dignity. Samuel S. Forman lives to 1862. He goes up north, and he reflects on his experience down south. And he lives actually to see his neighbors go off to the Civil War, but never finds out how it turns out. Doesn't live that long. Here's the things that got my attention. We're already over time. May I ask you the favor of filling out the survey form and passing it to my sister, or if you're leaving the room, up front. Thank you. We're over time. I talked for too long. Thank you very much. That was maybe a little bit too ambitious for. I know, but it was like too much. That's the issue. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but I'm just glad you made that.
Thank you.
I emailed you.
No, it's probably not.
You guys are.
Oh, yeah.